every man in 5 boroughs, feared Dante Moretti. They feared his name. They feared his silence. They feared the slow way he poured a drink before he ordered a man's death. They had seen him put a butcher's knife through a senator's hand at a Christmas party and finish his espresso afterward without rinsing the cup. They knew, the way men in that world know things, that he had buried his own brother in a foundation in Hoboken when his brother had crossed him at 23. They feared him the way the old country feared weather. And on a Tuesday in late October, in a private chapel that smelled of incense and rain, every man in 5 boroughs watched Dante Moretti marry a small, soft, silent woman whose wedding dress had been let out 3 times by the seamstress and who came barely to his chin. They watched him take her cold knuckles and press the most cursory kiss in human history to them. They watched him not look at her. They watched him not say her name. They watched, and they laughed quietly into their wine, and they pitied the man for the chubby little nothing he had been forced to wed. They had no idea. By the time the city understood, the woman in the let-out wedding dress had already buried 4 men, run a 6-month war from his own library, and made the most dangerous man in New York fall to his knees in a rose garden in the rain. Marco Vasquez died on a Friday. The bullet that killed him went through the back of his neck at a meeting in a parking garage in Queens, and Dante was 3 blocks away when the call came in, and he stood on the sidewalk in front of a coffee cart and listened to Salvador tell him, and he did not move for a full minute, and then he very calmly walked into traffic and put his hand through the windshield of a stopped Lincoln. The driver did not protest. The driver took one look at Dante Moretti's face and put the car in reverse. Dante walked the 3 blocks to the parking garage with his hand bleeding down his sleeve and saw his oldest friend on the concrete and did not cry. He had not cried in 15 years. He did not start that day. He held Marco's hand. The hand was already cold. He whispered something into Marco's ear that no one ever heard. Then he stood up, and he washed his hand at a gas station 2 blocks away, and he started, very methodically, to make a list of every man who could possibly have done it. The funeral was 3 days later. The funeral was a state event. The mayor came. The bishop came. Old men came who had not been seen in public in 20 years, and old men came who would not be seen in public again. Dante stood at the head of the casket and shook every hand and accepted every condolence, and did not, at any point, look at the small, dark-haired woman in the 2nd row who was Marco's only sister. He did glance at her once, briefly. He had a memory of her 15, maybe 16, in pigtails at a Christmas dinner, and he looked at the woman in the black coat and he thought, with a flicker of something he immediately filed under irritation, she's gotten heavy. The dress was tight at the bust. The coat was tight at the hips. He thought, and was ashamed of thinking, that grief had not been kind to Marco's little sister. She was not crying. He noticed that, even through his irritation. The other Vasquez women were sobbing. The mother was howling into a handkerchief. The cousins were leaning on each other. Ileana Vasquez stood between them and the open grave, and held a single white rose in her left hand, and her right hand pressed flat against her own chest, as if she were holding her own ribs in place. And she watched her brother go down into the dirt with the absolute stillness of a woman who had already done all of her grieving years before the grave was dug. He did not understand then what he was looking at. He thought she was numb. She was not numb. She was already calculating who in the front row had killed him. 3 days later, the lawyer slid the will across the marble desk in Dante's study, and Dante read the page twice before he understood what his oldest friend had done to him from beyond the grave. Marry her. Marry Ileana. Within 30 days. Or lose every account, every property, every soldier sworn to the Vasquez crest, to the Benventuras, to the men who had probably ordered Marco's death. Dante laughed once, low and bitter. He had killed men for less leverage than this. He had buried men in concrete for less. But not Marco. Never Marco. So he closed the will and he poured a grappa and he said to the lawyer very quietly, "Bring me the girl." When she walked into his study 3 days before the wedding, he did not stand for her. He did not offer her tea. He sat behind his desk with his shirt sleeves rolled and his cufflinks loose and a cigarette burning in a crystal ashtray, and he watched her cross his rug the way a man watches an animal he has not yet decided whether to feed. She was small, smaller than he remembered. The black wool coat hid most of her, but he could see the soft, full line of her under it, the curve at the hip where the coat caught, the gentle weight of her at the chest. Her face was round. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and the severity made her face look softer, not sharper, and he registered all of this with the cold, administrative attention of a man cataloging a problem. She was, he thought, exactly the kind of woman the men in his world ate alive. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. She folded her small, pale hands in her lap. She looked at him directly with eyes that were too steady for the rest of her, and he registered that too, registered it, and dismissed it as the brittle composure of a woman who had been raised among men and had learned to hold her face still. "Mr. Morty," she said. "Don't speak yet." She closed her mouth. He watched her another long moment. He let the cigarette burn down. He let the silence get expensive. He had broken hardened men in this chair with this silence. He watched her hands for the tremor. There was no tremor. Her hands were perfectly still. He tried not to be impressed. He told himself that it was shock that her hands hadn't caught up to her situation yet, and he leaned forward and he said very quietly, "I want you to understand what this is. You are the price of a debt I owe a dead man. I am going to marry you because I owe him my life. I am not going to touch you. I am not going to look at you. I am not going to remember your name unless I have to. You will live in the East Wing. You will not enter my study, my bedroom, or my library. In 1 year, when the will's protections are folded into the corporate structure, I will divorce you quietly and I will give you enough money to disappear. You will sign whatever I put in front of you. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Say it." "I understand." "Look at me when you say it." She lifted her chin. Her dark eyes met his and held. "I understand, Mr. Morty." He had expected her to break, somewhere in there. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading. He had expected the small rage of a woman who has been told she is a piece of furniture. He had expected something. What he got was that steady gaze and the perfect stillness of her hands, and after a moment he sat back in his chair and he picked up the cigarette and he gestured at the door without looking at her. "Go." She rose. She paused at the door. She turned back. For one moment she looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she is about to disagree with the rest of his life over. And Dante Moretti, who had broken senators in this chair, felt, for one absurd, glancing instant, looked at. "Mr. Morty," she said. "What?" "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "that he did this to you." She left. He sat in the chair for a long time after the door closed. The cigarette burned out in the ashtray. He did not light another. He told himself he was annoyed. He told himself it was the pity that had annoyed him, that this small, soft, round-cheeked woman had pitied him, of all people, in his own study, and had walked out before he could correct her about which of them was the hostage in this arrangement. He did not, he told himself, think about her again that night. He was lying. He did. He thought about the stillness of her hands. The wedding was on a Tuesday. He wore black, so did she. The dress was a deliberate, ugly thing, a high collar, long sleeves, no waist, and he understood, looking at her at the altar, that she had chosen it on purpose. She had dressed herself like a nun. She was, he realized, refusing to give him the satisfaction of being a bride. He registered with another flicker of that same irritation, almost impressed. The vows were the standard ones. She said them clearly. He said them looking at the cross above the altar. When the priest pronounced them, he took her hand, small, cold, soft, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles in the most cursory gesture of his life. A second. Less. A breath against the cold skin. He did not even close his eyes. Her knuckles did not flinch under his mouth. Salvetter walked her out afterward, because Dante was already on his phone. That night, alone in his study with a glass of grappa, Dante Moretti caught himself flexing the hand that had held hers, as though he had touched something hot. He poured another grappa. He told himself it was nothing. The first month, he barely saw her. He had given her the East Wing and she stayed in it. The staff brought her meals. The staff brought her books. Magda, the housekeeper, who had been with his family 30 years and who feared exactly nothing, reported when he asked that Mrs. Morty was quiet, polite, asked for nothing, and read. What does she read? Everything. Yesterday, history of the port unions. Day before, a book of Greek poetry in Greek. Last week, every newspaper from the last 6 months. Greek. In Greek, sir. He did not, he told himself, find this interesting. He saw her, in passing, 4 times in 6 weeks. Once in the corridor between the great hall and the kitchen, where she had stepped aside to let him pass and he had not slowed down. Once at a window on the 2nd floor, in a navy sweater, looking down at the rose garden. Once in the library, his library, not hers, where she had been pulling a book down from the shelf and had frozen when he came in and he had said, very flatly, "I told you not to come in here." And she had nodded once and replaced the book and walked past him without speaking, and the smell of her had hit him in the doorway. It was not a perfume. It was something simpler. Something like clean cotton and warm skin, and very faintly something sweet that might have been the soap the staff used. And Dante stood in the doorway after she had gone for a full 30 seconds before he went into his own library with a face like a thunderhead. The 4th time he saw her was at 3 in the morning. He had been working late. He was crossing the gallery on the 2nd floor, and the door to her wing was open, and he glanced in without meaning to, and she was sitting in his mother's old leather chair in the lamplight with her bare feet tucked under her thigh and her dark hair loose down her back, and a binder open on her lap and a pen between her teeth. And the lamp lit her from the side, and the curve of her cheek and the curve of her shoulder and the soft, full line of her under the navy sweater were lit gold in the lamplight. And she was so absorbed in whatever she was reading that she had not noticed him in the doorway. He stood there for a count of 3. He understood, with a small cold horror, that he was looking. He turned and walked away from the open door so quickly that his footfall sounded angry on the marble of the gallery. And he did not sleep that night, and in the morning he had Magda close the east wing doors at night going forward. He told himself it was for her privacy. He was lying again. He was already lying to himself about her, and he had been married to her for 6 weeks. The 2nd month, the strange things started. Salvator came to him on a Wednesday with a folder. "Boss, we got tipped on the Benventura warehouse, 20 minutes before they hit. Nobody on our side knew the route. Anonymous call, woman's voice, distorted." "Tipped by who?" "Don't know. She gave us 6 men of theirs dead, no losses on our side. Said, and I quote, 'They're coming through the loading dock. Roof access is unlocked. Put a man on the roof.' Hung up before we could trace." He did not then think of her. There was no reason to think of her. 2 weeks later, it happened again. A money laundering operation in Queens he had not even known the Benventuras were running. A list of names. A suggestion, phrased as a question, about which Manhattan judge to lean on. The same distorted voice. The same impossible accuracy. A month after that, it happened a 3rd time, and a 4th, and a 5th, and Salvator began to look haunted. "Boss, whoever this is, she knows our internal lines. She knows which ones are bugged. She knows our schedule. She's calling lines that won't be answered by men who'd notice a woman's voice." "You're sure it's a woman?" "Cadence, yeah, it's a woman." Dante drummed his fingers on the desk. He did not, he told himself, think of the bare feet under the thigh in the lamplit chair. He drove out to his uncle's house that weekend. Vincent Morty lived in a brownstone on the Upper East Side. He was Dante's father's brother. He had taught Dante to drive. He had walked Dante to his own father's casket 20 years ago. He had hugged Dante at the funeral of Marco Vasquez and said, in his low, careful voice, "Whatever you need, my boy, whatever you need. We'll find who did it together." He had brandy waiting when Dante walked in. He poured 2 glasses with the precise hands of a man who had poured 10,000 glasses for 10,000 difficult conversations. He sat across from Dante in his study, and his eyes, pale, kind, watery, held Dante's with the warmth of a man who had loved his nephew since the nephew was 4. "You look thin, my boy." "I'm fine, Uncle." "You're not eating." "I'm fine." Vincent leaned forward. He patted Dante's knee. The hand that patted had a tremor in it now. Vincent was 68, and Dante registered the tremor with a flicker of tenderness that he did not then examine. And the wife, the Vasquez girl. She's quiet. Quiet is good. She's fine, she reads. Reads, Vincent chuckled. Well, a reading wife is better than a talking one. Eh? He laughed at his own joke, the wheezy laugh Dante had loved since childhood, and Dante laughed too, faintly, and Vincent reached across and refilled Dante's brandy. I would like to meet her, you know. You will. Bring her to dinner. Sunday. Aunt Marissa is making the lamb. All right. Good. Vincent leaned back. He looked at his nephew over the rim of the brandy glass. His pale, watery eyes were fond. I worry about you, you know, with Marco gone. You take too much on your shoulders alone, my boy. You always have, even as a child. I'm fine, Uncle. Oh. The fond, pale eyes held Dante's another long second. It was the eyes that Dante would remember much later when he understood. There had been something in them that night that he had not seen because he had not been looking for it. A certain kind of warmth that was warm in the wrong way. A certain kind of fond that was already mourning him. He drove home that night thinking about how lucky he was to still have his uncle. Sunday dinner at Vincent's was a quiet affair. Ileana wore a navy dress with a high neck. She thanked Aunt Marissa for the lamb. She complimented the centerpiece. She spoke 7 complete sentences over the course of the entire meal, and not one of them was interesting. She kept her eyes on her plate. She laughed, very softly and very politely, at one of Vincent's jokes. She did not, at any point in the evening, look at Vincent for more than half a second. Dante watched her perform stupidity for 2 hours. He did not, then, know what he was watching. He knew only that, on the drive home, in the back of the car, she was very quiet. Her small, soft hands were folded in her lap. The streetlights moved across her face in slow, pale waves. He watched her in the dark of the car for a long time before he said, You did not say much tonight. No. Why? Your uncle does not like women who talk. How did you know? He does not like women, Mr. Morty. He tolerates them. There is a difference. Dante turned his head to look at her in the moving light. She was still looking at her hands. Her face was perfectly composed. Her voice had been perfectly even. How did you know? He said again, slower. He didn't ask me one question all evening, not where I grew up, not whether I had siblings, not whether I was happy. He asked you 43 questions. He asked your bodyguard 6 questions. He looked at me only when he wanted Marissa to refill my plate. She paused. He is a man who does not believe women have anything to say, so I said nothing. It seemed kinder. Dante did not speak the rest of the way home. When they got out of the car at the estate, she walked ahead of him into the house, and she went up the stairs to the east wing, and he stood in the great hall watching her go up, and he registered, for the first time, with the small, slow horror of a man watching his own assumptions die, that his wife had counted Vincent's questions. That night, Dante Moretti walked the east wing of his own house for the first time in 3 months. He stopped outside the library door. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor in the dark and he listened. He could hear the soft turn of a page. He could hear, very faintly, her humming. It was a song he half knew. It was a song from his childhood. It was the same song his mother had sung to him when he was sick. He stood in the corridor a long time. He went back to his own room without going in. He did not sleep. The next time the anonymous call came in, he was in the room. The lieutenants were huddled around the speaker. Salvator was leaning forward, jaw tight. The distorted voice was steady. There is a meeting tomorrow at the Lighthouse Club at 10 p.m. Don Benventura will be there. He will be flanked by his nephew and 1 bodyguard. The bodyguard's gun is in his right ankle holster. He was shot in the left shoulder last spring and can no longer reach behind himself. The nephew is unarmed because he believes himself untouchable. There is a blind spot in the security camera over the bar between 10:03 and 10:08. The bartender is paid by the Caparelli family and will leave the room at exactly 10:04 for a cigarette. You will have 4 minutes. A pause. Be careful what you do with this. Killing him will start a war you may not be ready for. Capturing him will give you a card you can play for a decade. Choose. Click. The lieutenants looked at each other. Dante looked at the speaker, and he listened in his head to a song his mother used to sing. He stood up. He walked out of the room without a word. He walked across the great hall. He walked up the stairs. He walked through the gallery. He walked through the closed double doors of the east wing. He pushed open the library door without knocking. She was at the desk. Her hair was down. The lamp was on. The small black notebook was open in front of her, and a pen was in her hand, and she lifted her face when the door opened, and for the first time in 4 months he saw her not be still. She froze. For 1 second, the round, soft, careful face of his wife was the face of a woman who had been caught. Then it composed itself. She set the pen down. She closed the notebook with one slow, careful finger. She folded her small, pale hands on top of the closed cover. "You weren't on the call line," she said. "I was careful." He closed the door behind him. His hand was, he noticed, shaking. "How long?" he said. "Since a month after he died." "How?" "I read, I listen, I make calls. The Vasquez network didn't die with him, it just quieted. I've been waking it up, carefully." "You have his network." She lifted her chin. She had not, this entire conversation, looked away from him. "I had his network," she said, "before he had it." He sat down in the leather chair, by the fire, because his legs were not reliable. "Explain," he said, "all of it now." She did not explain it sitting at the desk. She stood up. She walked across the rug to him in her bare feet, small, soft, deliberate, and she stopped in front of his chair, and she looked down at him, and the lamp caught her from behind, and the line of her hip and the curve of her waist and the soft, full weight of her at the chest were lit gold against the dark, and her face was in shadow, and her dark eyes were the only things he could see clearly, and they did not flinch, and they did not blink, and they did not soften. "Stand up," she said. "What?" "Stand up, Dante." It was the first time she had used his Christian name to his face. He stood up. She was very small in front of him. The top of her head came barely to his chest. He could have lifted her with one arm. He could have broken her in half. He had broken bigger men with less effort. She knew this. She had to know this. She did not step back. "Give me your hand," she said. He gave her his hand. She turned it over so the palm was up. She placed her own small, soft palm flat against his. And she pressed. He did not understand at first what she was doing. Then his wrist moved. Then his elbow. Then his shoulder. She was, with a single steady press of her small, soft palm, locking out his arm. He felt the joint go. He felt the small, precise pressure on the nerve at the base of his thumb. He felt with a slow, dawning electric clarity that if she increased the pressure by 1 degree, his shoulder would dislocate. If she increased it by 2, his wrist would break. If she increased it by 3, he would be on the floor. He had not seen her move. "This is a Wing Chun Kai Sao trap," she said quietly. "I've been doing it since I was 9. I could teach it to you. It would take about a year. I will not need a year. Sit down." She let go. He sat down. His hand was tingling. She stood in front of him in the lamplight with her dark hair down and her small, pale hands at her sides, and she looked at him with the eyes he had finally seen for the first time, and she said very softly, "My mother had me trained from the age of 7. My father did not know. Marco did not know until I was 12. By the time I was 15, I could put any man in this house on the floor in under 3 seconds, and I could read a balance sheet in 4 languages, and I could remember every face I had ever seen, and I could tell when a man was lying by the 3rd syllable. I told my mother once, I was 8, that my father was going to die in prison. I had heard a thing he said on the telephone that he had not known I was on the line for. She slapped me. Then she held me for an hour. Then she found me a teacher. By the time my father went to Sing Sing, I had been preparing for it for 2 years." She paused. "Marco wanted to make me his consigliera. I told him no. I told him there was a better way. I told him the men in our world do not survive once people know what they are worth, and that the way to keep him alive was for me to be worthless. On paper. In every way that mattered to the men he ran with. The shy little sister. The chubby little sister. The girl who reads too much. The girl who is never at the table. I built that. I built it carefully. I built it for a decade. I built it so well that you walked into our house on Christmas 8 years in a row, and you did not see me once. He stared at her. I have been the brain of the Vasquez family since I was 16 years old, she said. I have been the brain of yours for 4 months. I am... Her voice did not break, but it wavered just once on the word. I am sorry. Ileana. I needed you alive. I could not tell you. You would not have believed the woman you'd married out of guilt. You would have laughed and you would have died. So I gave it to you in a way you'd have to act on. I gave you my brother's empire one warning at a time. I am sorry, Dante. I am sorry for the manipulation. I am not sorry for the saving. He could not speak. He stared at her in the lamplight, at her small, soft, round face, at the dark hair down her back, at the curve of her hip and the line of her shoulder and the bare feet and the steady, terrible, brilliant eyes. He understood, with a slow, sliding, vertiginous shift, that he had been married to her for 4 months and had not, for 1 second, known her. He stood up. She did not move. He took 1 step toward her. She held her ground. He took another. He was very close to her now. He could feel the warmth of her. He could see the slight quickening at the soft hollow of her throat where her pulse showed. So she was not, he realized, as composed as her face. He found that he was glad of it. He found that he was glad of it with a force that frightened him. Ileana, he said. His voice came out rough. Did Marco know what he was doing when he made that will? Yes. He wanted this. He wanted us alive. Did he want? He could not finish the sentence. Yes. Yes, what? Yes, Dante. He wanted what you are about to ask. He looked at her in the lamplight a long time. Then he reached up, slowly, slowly, the way a man reaches for something he is afraid will dissolve under his hand, and he took her face in his palm, and his thumb traced the soft, full curve of her cheek that he had spent 4 months not looking at, and he said, very low, "Tell me to go." No. Ileana. No, Dante, I am not telling you to go. Tell me you don't want this, and I will walk out of this room, and I will never come back in it again. Tell me. Now. Tell me one time, and I will believe you. She did not tell him. She lifted onto her toes, small, soft, deliberate, and she put her small, pale hands flat against his chest, and she said, I have been waiting to be looked at by you since I was 17 years old. His hands went into her hair. He had not held a woman's face like this in a decade. He had not held a woman's face like this, possibly, ever. His hands were shaking. He held her face in both palms as if she were a thing that would shatter if he held her wrong, and her eyes, dark, steady, finally. Finally a loud held his, and he bent his head and he stopped, an inch from her mouth, and he said, Ileana, if I do this, I am not going to be able to stop. Then don't. His voice was wrecked. I am going to be possessive. About you, I am going to be possessive in ways that are going to scare you. I know. I am going to want to know where you are at every hour. I am going to want Ileana. I am going to want. I know. I am not soft. I do not know how to be soft. I will hurt you without meaning to. I will hurt you knowing I am doing it. I am. Dante. What? You have been holding my face for 30 seconds and you have not yet kissed me. Stop talking. He kissed her. He had not, he realized as he was doing it, ever kissed a woman like this in his life. Slow, trembling, with the whole of him. His mouth on hers was the first time in 15 years he had been gentle with anything, and the gentleness undid him. He felt her small, soft hands slide up his chest and lock at the back of his neck. He felt her mouth open under his. He felt the whole of her go warm and willing against the whole of him. He pulled her closer with a sound that did not, in any way, sound like him. When he finally lifted his head, her eyes were wet, and her cheeks were flushed pink, and her mouth was swollen, and she was looking up at him in the lamplight with the most dangerous, most loving, most entirely defenseless face he had ever seen on a human being. "Ileana," he said. "Yes. I am not letting you go. I know. I am not letting you go. Do you understand?" "Yes. Say it." "I am not letting you go either, Dante." He pressed his forehead to hers. He stood there in the lamplight with her, and he closed his eyes, and the song he had heard her humming through the door was, he realized now, the song Marco had sung to her when their mother was sick. It was the song his own mother had sung to him. It was the song two grieving women in two different boroughs in two different decades had sung to two different children. He understood then, with a slow, terrible warmth, that his oldest friend had not given him a wife. His oldest friend had given him, with the quiet, patient cruelty of a dying man, a home. He did not understand yet that Marco was already dying. He did not understand yet that the will had been a year in the planning. He did not understand yet what his uncle had done, what his uncle was about to do, what Ileana had been quietly assembling in the small black notebook under the lamp every night for 4 months. He understood only that the small, soft, round-cheeked woman in the let-out wedding dress had a hand at the back of his neck, and a mouth swollen by his mouth, and a body warm against his body, and that he had, 4 months ago, married her, and that he had somehow, without noticing it, fallen. It would take him another 6 weeks to learn how far. The first time he frightened her, it was a Thursday. They had been in the city. They had taken her to a small restaurant on Mulberry that he had been going to since he was 11, a place run by a Sicilian widow who had been at his first communion. And the waiter, a young one Dante did not know, had brought the wine and had let his eyes rest, just a beat too long, on the soft, full line of Ileana under her gray dress. Dante had seen the beat. He had put his glass down very carefully on the white tablecloth. He had not raised his voice. He had not stood up. He had only looked at the waiter once, the way he looked at men in parking garages, and the waiter, who was 22, who had been in this country a year, who had a mother in Catania, had gone the color of milk, and his hand had begun to shake on the bottle, and he had set the bottle down, and he had walked very carefully back to the kitchen, and a different waiter, older, gray-haired, who knew the family, had finished serving the table. Ileana watched all of it without moving. When the older waiter had withdrawn, she lifted her wine. She took a small sip. She set the glass down. She said very quietly across the candle, "Dante." "Yes." "That boy is going to lose his job tonight." "Yes." "He has done nothing." "He looked at you." "Dante." "What?" "He looked at me for a second. He is 22. He looked because he is 22 and I am sitting in a candle in a dress and there is nothing in his life he can do about it. Look at me." He looked at her. Her round, soft face was very calm. Her dark eyes were not. "If you ruin that boy tonight," she said, "I will know something about you that I have until this moment chosen not to know. I will know it for the rest of my life. I will not be able to unknow it. I am asking you, husband, please, to not make me know it." He stared at her across the candle. For one long second, the man in him that he had been afraid of his entire life stood up at the table. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She did not move her hand from her glass. She held his eyes the way she had held them in his study 8 months ago, the way she had held them in the lamplight, the way she had held them in every room she had ever stood across from him in, and he understood slowly, with a kind of cold clarity that was almost a relief, that she had seen him. All of him. The piece of him he kept locked. The piece of him he had been waiting his whole adult life for a woman to flinch from. She was not flinching. She was waiting. He looked at her in the candle for a long time. Then he reached across the white cloth and he took her small, pale hand in his, and he turned it over, and he pressed his mouth to the soft, hot center of her palm, and he closed his eyes, and he said into her palm, all right, my love, all right." When he opened his eyes, she was crying, very quietly, without sound. Just 2 tears down the round, soft cheek nearest the candle. "Ileana, I'm not afraid of you. I know. I want you to hear me. I am not afraid of you. I am afraid of losing you to you. There is a difference. Do you hear me? Yes. Say it. I hear you, my love. He paid the bill himself. He left the young waiter a tip that would feed his mother in Catania for 6 months. He walked Ileana out with his hand at the small of her back, and on the way to the car he leaned down and pressed his mouth to her temple and said, very low, "Thank you." For what? For staying. She did not answer. She only turned her face into his coat and walked the rest of the way to the car with her cheek against his shoulder, and Dante Moretti, who had been afraid of himself for 38 years, felt the lock he had carried inside his chest since he was 9 years old give, just slightly, in the cold. That night, in the bedroom, the lock gave further. He had not, before her, ever let a woman undress him in light. He kept the lights off. He kept the woman quiet. He kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the door and his hands where the woman could not feel any of the scars that the Morty name had paid for over 38 years. He had, in his life, slept with 23 women, and not one of them had seen the long, pale knife scar that ran from the inside of his elbow up to his collarbone. Not one of them had seen the bullet at his hip. Not one had seen the cigarette burn his Uncle Vincent had given him at the age of 9 for a lesson he could no longer remember the substance of. He had, that night in the candle, told himself he would keep the bedroom dark. He came up the stairs behind her. She walked into the bedroom ahead of him. She turned. She walked over to the lamp on the bedside table, the small one, the warm one, the one his mother had read to him by, and she turned it on. He stopped in the doorway. Ileana. Yes. I prefer the dark. She did not turn the lamp off. She stood next to it in the warm pool of light, and she lifted her hands to the buttons at the front of her dress, and she undid the first one, very slowly, watching his face. Ileana. I know. I do not, Ileana, I am not. I know. You do not want to see. Yes, I do. She undid the second button. He did not move. She undid the third. The dress slipped off one shoulder. The lamplight caught the soft, full line of her collarbone, the round slope of her shoulder, the gentle weight of her at the chest, and Dante Moretti, who had once put a butcher's knife through a senator's hand at a Christmas party, found that he could not, in the doorway of his own bedroom, take a step forward. Dante, she said softly. Yes. Come here. He came. He came the way men come to altars. He stopped in front of her at the lamp. She was very small in front of him. The top of her head came barely to his chest. She lifted her hands, and she did not put them on the dress, and she did not put them on him. She put them on the buttons of his shirt. She undid the first one. She undid the second. She undid the third. He closed his eyes. He could not at first stand it. She did not stop. She undid the fourth. She undid the fifth. She slid the shirt off his shoulders and let it fall to the floor, and the lamplight fell on him for the first time in his adult life in front of a woman who had not been paid to see him, and he stood in his own bedroom with his eyes closed and his hands trembling at his sides, and he waited. He waited for the flinch. He waited for the small, involuntary intake of breath. He waited for the eyes that would slide off the long, pale knife scar, for the polite mouth that would not mention the cigarette burn, for the small hand that would touch carefully around the bullet at his hip, the way women had touched carefully around it for 15 years. He waited for the thing he had built his whole life around expecting. What he got was her mouth on the cigarette burn. He flinched. She did not stop. She put her mouth on the cigarette burn at his shoulder. Then she put her mouth on the long, pale knife scar. She traced it with her lips from the inside of his elbow up to his collarbone. She put her mouth on the bullet at his hip. She did not say a word. She did not ask. She kissed every old wound on his body the way a woman kisses a church floor, and when she was done, she lifted her face, wet, soft, terrible, and she put her small pale hands on either side of his face, and she said very quietly, "There is no part of you I am not staying for. Do you understand?" He could not speak. Say yes, Dante. Yes. Say it again. Yes. There is no part of you I am not staying for. There is no part of you I am not staying for. That's right, now come to bed. He did not, that night, keep the lights off. He did not, ever again, keep the lights off. He learned, in that bedroom, in the warm pool of his mother's old lamp, what it was to be looked at by a woman who had decided to look at him on purpose. He learned the difference between not being flinched from and being chosen. He learned, with a slow, sliding, vertiginous astonishment, that the man he had been afraid of his entire life was, to his wife, simply the man she had married. He held her after on the rumpled lamplit bed. Her hair was down. Her mouth was swollen. She was lying with her cheek on his chest, on the long, pale knife scar she had kissed, and her small, pale hand was flat over his heart. He had his face in her hair. He could not, for a long time, speak. When he could, he said, very quietly, "Ileana." "Yes. I have been afraid of myself my whole life." "I know." "You knew." "I have known you longer than you think, Dante. Do not forget that." He pressed his mouth into her hair. "What do I do with that?" he said. "With what?" With not being afraid of myself anymore. I do not know what to do with that. I have built 38 years on it. I do not know who I am if I am not." "Dante." "Yes. You are the man whose chest I am sleeping on tonight. That is a sufficient identity. Sleep." He laughed. It was a small, wet, startled laugh that he had not, in 15 years, had in him. She tightened her hand over his heart. "Sleep, husband." "Yes. I love you. Ileana." "Sleep." He slept. The next morning at breakfast, she was at his table. Magda set the small round table by the window for two without being asked. Ileana came down in jeans and a soft gray sweater that did not hide the soft, full line of her, and she had her hair in a long, loose braid down her back, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw him, and the corner of her mouth lifted in a small, private smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Morty." "Good morning, husband." He stood up when she came to the table. He pulled out her chair. She sat. He pushed her chair in. He did not sit down. He stood behind her for 1 second, and he bent, and he pressed his mouth to the top of her head, gently, almost reverent, and she closed her eyes, and her small, soft hand came up over his at the back of her chair, and he stayed there a moment with his mouth in her hair before he took the seat across from her. Magda, in the doorway with the coffee pot, made a small sound that was either a sniff or a sob, and turned briskly away with her shoulders set very square. "Ileana." "Yes." "Tell me about my uncle." The smile left her face. She set down her coffee. "How long do you have?" "All morning." "Then sit back, Dante." She told him for 2 hours. She told him about the money trails she had been following for 5 weeks. She told him about the 2 Benventura lieutenants she had identified as flippable. She told him about the second cousin who would testify. She told him about the way Vincent had been buying up debt on 3 of Dante's Brooklyn properties for 8 months. She told him about the meeting Vincent had taken with Don Benventura on a Tuesday in August. She told him about the man Vincent had hired 8 months ago, who would, 3 weeks from this Sunday, be sent to Dante's house with a Glock and a cyanide capsule in a tooth. "His name is Tommaso." "My cousin Tommaso." "Yes. You know the date." "I know the date and the room." He listened to her with his hands folded on the tablecloth and his coffee growing cold in front of him, and when she was done, he was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very, very even. "Ileana." "Yes. I am going to drive to my uncle's house this morning, and I am going to take his eyes out of his head with a butter knife, and I am going to leave them on his wife's pillow." "No." "Ileana." "No, Dante, look at me." He looked at her. "Listen to me," she said. "You cannot kill him in his own house with his wife and his daughters in the next room. You cannot do that. That is what they want. That is what makes you the monster the city needs an excuse to take down. We are going to do this clean. We are going to do this right. I have a plan. I have him on tape. I have him on paper. I have his money trails. I have the second cousin. I have the lieutenants. I have a way to take everything he is and leave him with nothing, and let him die alone in a state prison knowing the boy he raised, is the one who put him there." She paused. "And Dante?" "What?" "I have a way to do it that lets me sit across a table from him first. Alone. With tea. So that he understands, before he is taken from his garden in his slippers, that the person who broke him was the chubby little sister of the friend he had killed." Dante stared at her across the table. He felt slowly, his mouth begin to curve. "My wife," he said softly. "Your wife?" "My terrifying, terrifying wife." "Yes." "All right, Ileana, we do it your way." She had Sunday tea with Vincent Morty 6 weeks later. She went alone. She wore a soft pink dress with a high neckline. She wore her hair down. She wore the smallest possible gold cross at her throat. She came up the steps of the brownstone with a tin of the cookies Aunt Marissa had complimented at the Sunday dinner 2 months before, and she rang the bell, and Aunt Marissa opened the door, and Ileana smiled at her with the round, soft, empty face she had perfected at 16. "I brought you the cookies. I asked Magda for the recipe." "Oh, sweetheart. Is Uncle Vincent home?" "He's in the study, sweetheart. Go on in. He'll be so pleased." Vincent rose when she entered the study. He rose with the warmth of a man rising for a niece he had decided was harmless. He kissed her cheek. He poured her a small sherry. "You're so small, my dear, just a thimble." And he sat across from her in his pale, watery eyes and his fond paternal smile. And Ileana Morty, who came barely to his chest, sat in his armchair with her ankles crossed and her small, pale hands folded in her lap, and she sipped her sherry, and she smiled at him. "How is my nephew?" "He's well. He works too hard." "He does. He always has, even as a boy." And you, my dear, are you adjusting? It's a difficult thing, marriage, especially to a man like Dante. He is," Vincent smiled. "He is not always easy. He is wonderful to me." Of course, of course." Vincent leaned back. The pale, watery eyes went over her face, the round cheeks, the soft mouth, the small gold cross, with the slow, tender attention of an uncle assessing a new piece of family. He sipped his brandy. He said very kindly, "You know, my dear, I worry about him." "Do you?" "I do. Marco's death he is not himself. He is taking risks. He is making decisions that," Vincent sighed, "that older men who have seen more would not make. I have tried to advise him. He does not always listen." "He should listen to you." He should, my dear. And you know," Vincent leaned forward and patted her knee, the way he had patted Dante's knee. "You know, my dear. You are in a position to help him. A wife sees things a man's lieutenants do not see. She knows the small things, the moods, the phone calls in the middle of the night, the little names that come up at the dinner table." He smiled. "If you were ever to feel concerned about something, anything, you could come to me. As family, you understand." Ileana looked at him over the rim of her sherry. She let the silence get expensive. She let it get one beat past polite. Then she set down the glass. Her hand was steady. She let it be steady on purpose, and then slowly, deliberately, in the small, private way she had once let Marco see her tremble in the kitchen the night she told him about the diagnosis, she let her thumb shake against the stem. Just once. Just enough for a man who was looking. She wanted Vincent to see it. She wanted Vincent to understand, much later, sitting in a state prison alone, that the tremor had not been fear. It had been her brother's name in her hand. "Uncle Vincent," she said gently, "I would like to be very honest with you for a moment. May I?" "Of course, my dear." "I know." "You know what, my dear?" "I know about the meeting in August with Don Benventura. I know about the Brooklyn debts you have been buying up since March. I know about the lieutenants you offered $4 million each to. I know about the second cousin you sent to talk to my late brother in the parking garage in Queens." Her voice did not break. It thinned. The sound a wire makes when it is being pulled tight by a hand that has been pulling on it for a long time. "I know about Tommaso. I know about the cyanide capsule in his back left molar. I know which dentist installed it. I know what you paid him. I know what you ate the day you decided. I know what you wore. I know, Uncle Vincent." She stopped. She breathed in. She breathed out. The tremor went out of her thumb. Her hand on the sherry glass was perfectly still again. "I know every step you took to murder my brother," she said quietly, "and every step you have taken to murder my husband. I know them not because I have been told them, but because I have been watching you very patiently for 5 months from a chair in the east wing of a house you have never set foot in. Do you understand me?" The fond paternal smile did not move on Vincent's face. It froze. The pale, watery eyes did not blink. The brandy glass in his hand did not move. For one long second, the only thing that moved in the room was the small clock on the mantel. "My dear," Vincent said softly, "you are confused." "No. You are confused, sweetheart. You have heard things from your husband." "My husband," she said, "did not know any of this 12 hours ago." The brandy glass shook, very slightly. Then it did not. Vincent set it down on the small table beside him with the careful, precise hand of a man who had decided, in the space of one breath, to stop being warm. The fond paternal mask did not crack. It dissolved. The watery pale eyes were not watery any longer. They were dry and pale and very, very cold. "Ileana," he said. She did not move. "You small," he said softly, "small thing. You small, soft, fat little thing. Marco kept you in a back room for 10 years for a reason. Did you ever think about why?" "I built that back room myself, Uncle. He didn't keep me there. I lived there." "You lived there because you knew. You knew that the day you walked out of it, men like me were going to bury you. The way I buried your father, the way I buried Marco. You think you came in here today with the upper hand. You came in here today as a girl in a pink dress with a cross around your neck who has read too many books." He leaned forward. His voice was very quiet. "I have killed 3 women in my life, Ileana. None of them saw it coming. None of them. The last one was in this room. In that chair you are sitting in. She drank a sherry I had poured her, just like the one in your hand." Ileana looked down at the sherry. She looked up. She set the sherry down, on the side table next to her chair. She did not blink. "Then it is fortunate, Uncle Vincent," she said gently, "that I did not drink it. I do not drink with men who killed my brother. I drink with my husband." Vincent's mouth moved, just a flicker, the corner pulled. It was almost a smile. "You are your mother," he said softly. "I see her in you. I should have seen her in you before." "Yes, you should have. It would have saved me a great deal of trouble. It would have saved my brother." He did not answer that. He sat in his chair and he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in his life. And Ileana let him. She let him look. She let him watch the round, soft, empty face he had walked past for 10 years sharpen into a face he had never been allowed to see. And she let him understand, in the long, slow silence, that the sister of the boy he had killed had been in his house at every Christmas dinner for a decade, and he had never noticed her once. Then she stood up. She smoothed the front of her pink dress. She picked up the tin of cookies from the small table. She walked across the room. She set the tin down on Vincent's desk, gently, very gently, on top of his daily appointment book, on top of the pen he had used that very morning to sign a check for the man who would, 3 weeks from this Sunday, walk into Dante's house with a Glock. And she turned, and she walked back across the room, and she stopped in the doorway. "Uncle Vincent." "Yes." "The federal agents who will arrest you are coming on Tuesday. They will come at 6 in the morning. They will let you put on a coat. They will not let you put on shoes. You will be walked out of your garden in your slippers. My husband will be standing across the street. I will be next to him. You will look at him, and then you will look at me, and you will understand before you go into the car that the woman who broke you was the chubby little sister of the friend you had killed. I am telling you this in advance, Uncle Vincent, so that you have 2 days to think about it. Goodbye." She walked out of the study. She kissed Aunt Marissa on the cheek in the hall. She left the cookies on the desk. She got in the car at the curb where Salvator was waiting, and she sat very still for 10 blocks, and then she folded forward over her knees, and she did not cry. She had not yet cried for Marco. She would not cry for Marco for another 6 weeks. But she breathed, for the first time in 8 months, the deep, ragged, unhurried breaths of a woman who had finally said the things she had been carrying in her teeth. Salvator, in the front seat, did not look in the mirror. Salvator, in the front seat, was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Vincent Morty was arrested on a Tuesday at 6 in the morning in his slippers in his garden, exactly as she had told him, and Dante stood across the street in a black coat with his small, soft, round-cheeked wife in a wool coat at his side. And Vincent's pale, watery eyes went, as the agents walked him to the car, first to Dante and then to her. He held her gaze. He did not protest. He did not curse. He nodded once at his nephew, the smallest possible acknowledgement of a younger man who had won, and he allowed the agents to put him in the car. He died in a prison hospital 18 months later. Dante did not attend the funeral. He sent flowers. The flowers had no card. In between the tea and the funeral, in the long 6 weeks of preparation, the small, soft, round-cheeked woman became the only thing in Dante Morty's house. She was in his library. She was in his study. She was at his breakfast table. She was at his dinner table. She was in his bed. He had not, for one night since the lamplit library, slept without her. He could not. He had tried. The first night after the Kaisao in the firelight, he had walked her to the door of the east wing, and he had kissed her once, slow, on the threshold. And he had gone back to his own bedroom alone, and he had lain in his bed staring at the ceiling for 40 minutes before he had gotten up, walked the length of the gallery in his bare feet, opened her door, found her sitting up in the lamplight as if she had been waiting, and said, "Move over." She had moved over. He had not, since, slept anywhere else. He was, as he had warned her, possessive. He was possessive in ways that, 3 months earlier, would have disgusted him in another man. He wanted to know where she was. He texted her at noon every day from his study and waited for the response. He had Salvator put 2 men on her at all times when she left the house, and a third when she went into the city, and a fourth when she walked to the rose garden at the back of the property. And she had laughed at him for the fourth, the first time, and he had said very quietly, "Ileana, it is not a joke. I have lost one person to this life. I am not going to lose another. Indulge me." And she had stopped laughing, and she had stood on her toes and kissed him, and she had said, "Indulged." He was possessive of small things. The way her hair fell over her shoulder when she bent over the binder. The way she said his name in the morning, sleep rough. The way her small, soft hand fit in his. The way other men in his world looked at her, now that they had begun to notice her. Now that the chubby, quiet wife had begun to walk into rooms on his arm with her hair down and her chin up and her small, round face soft and her eyes terrible. And he watched each of them notice her, and he watched each of them recalculate, and he felt, in his chest, a low animal heat that he had never in his life felt for a woman before. He told her about it, one night in the library, with her in his lap in the leather chair, and his mouth at the soft skin of her temple. "They look at you now. Do they?" "They did not before." "No. They are wondering what they missed." Ileana." "Yes. If any one of them ever." "Dante." "What?" "You are the only man on earth who ever saw me. Do you understand? You are the only one. There is nothing in any of those rooms for any of those men. There is nothing in my life that is not yours." He had pressed his face into her hair, and he had not, for a long second, trusted his voice. "Say it again," he had finally said. "There is nothing in my life that is not yours." It had not been enough. He had asked her, every night for a week in different ways, and every night she had told him, and every night he had pulled her closer, and every night he had understood slowly, with a kind of terrified joy, that he was a man who had needed to be loved for a very long time and had not, until her, had any idea. He learned soft. He was not good at it. He learned anyway. He brought her tea in the library at 3 in the afternoon. He carried her up the stairs one night when she had fallen asleep at the desk. He kissed the inside of her wrist before he left for work. He left small notes in the margins of her binder, eat, rest. "I love you" in his hard, square hand, and the first time she had found one she had cried, very quietly, alone in the library, and Magda had found her and brought her tea and not said a word and gone away again, and Magda had told Dante, that night with her old hand on his arm in the corridor, "Mr. Morty, whatever you did, keep doing it." He kept doing it. He learned, also, the slow things. He learned that she liked her coffee with too much sugar in it, and was embarrassed by this, and that the embarrassment was the most adorable thing in his life. He learned that she sang in the bath, in Greek, badly, and that when he stood outside the door listening to her one Sunday morning, he had to put his fist against his mouth so she would not hear him laughing. He learned that she could not stand the sound of cutlery on porcelain, that she pulled the sleeves of his shirts over her hands when he gave them to her to wear, that she fell asleep in the car if he drove for more than 20 minutes, that she slept curled against his side with her cheek on the long, pale knife scar she had kissed in the lamplight, that she woke up confused for the first 3 seconds of every morning, and then remembered him and smiled before her eyes were fully open. He learned that her smile, in the first second of every morning, was the only sober thing he wanted out of the rest of his life. He took her to Sicily. He had never taken a woman to Sicily. He took her to the small village his grandmother had been born in, and he walked her down a stone street that smelled of lemons, and an old woman in black, who could not have known him, took one look at his face from across a piazza and crossed herself, and said something to her companion that he could not hear, and Eliana, who had 2 languages of Sicilian dialect that he did not know she had, laughed quietly into his shoulder and said, "She said you have your grandmother's mouth. She remembers your grandmother. You should buy her an espresso." "How do you know what she said?" "I know everything, Dante." "Yes. Buy the woman an espresso." He bought the woman an espresso. He held Eliana's hand through every street of that village. He held it through the small church where his grandmother had been baptized. He held it through the tiny cemetery where his great-grandfather was buried under a stone that read for his wife everything. Eliana had stopped at that stone and her hand had tightened in his, and she had read the inscription, and she had said very softly, "Dante." "Yes. That's a good line." "Yes. Will you put one like that on mine?" He had stopped breathing. He had turned her by the elbow and he had put his hands on her face the way he always did when she said a thing he could not survive without holding, and he had said, very low in the small cemetery in Sicily under the lemon tree, "You are not going first. Do you hear me? I am going first. I have decided." "Dante, I have decided." "Dante, you cannot decide that." "I have decided. Look at me. Ileana, I have decided. You are not going first. I am not Ileana. I am not going to be the man who buries you. Do not ask that of me. Do not, do not." She had pressed her forehead to his. She had not argued. She had said very softly, "All right, husband, all right, you first." It would, much later, become the small private joke between them. The thing he asked her to promise after every minor illness, every long flight, every news of a friend's funeral. "You first." And she would touch his face and she would say, in the patient, warm voice of a woman humoring the man she loved, "Yes, Dante. You first." And he would hold her, and he would believe it because she had said it, and he had decided years ago that whatever she said about the future was the future. She had not, in 8 years of marriage, been wrong about anything. He did not know, that day in the cemetery, that he was right. He did not know, that day in the cemetery, that he had decided correctly. He did not know yet about the quiet doctor's appointment Ileana had taken, alone, 6 weeks before the trip to Sicily, with her brother's old physician, who had asked her some careful questions and looked at some careful results and said very gently, "Mrs. Morty, there is something we need to talk about." She did not tell him. She would not tell him for another 2 years. She would tell him, in the end, the way her brother had told her, sitting on the edge of his bed in the lamplight, one Tuesday in September, with the small, tired face of a woman who had been carrying a thing in her teeth for a long time and was finally putting it down, and she would say, "Dante, I'm going to start writing my will." And he would understand before the rest of the sentence was out of her mouth, and the lock he had carried inside his chest for 38 years, the lock she had eased open in the candle on Mulberry, the lock she had emptied in the lamplit bedroom with her mouth on the cigarette burn. The lock would, finally, all the way, break. But that was later. That was much, much later. That was a different chapter of a longer book, and it would, in the end, be the most important chapter, but not yet. For now, in the small Sicilian cemetery under the lemon tree, he held her, and he was a man who did not know that the woman in his arms was going to ask him, eventually, to bury her. And the not knowing was the gift she gave him for 2 more years. And he loved her, that day, in the lemon-smelling sun with the whole of him, and he did not know, yet, what the whole of him was capable of. He would find out. The night of Vincent's arrest, Ileana cried for the first time he had ever seen. They were in the bedroom. The lamps were low. He had carried her up the stairs because she had not slept the night before and her hands had been trembling all evening. He had set her down on the edge of the bed. He had knelt in front of her. He had taken her small, pale hands in his, the hands he had once watched for the tremor, the hands that had been perfectly still in his study 8 months ago, the hands that had broken his uncle from a sherry glass at Sunday tea, and he had pressed his mouth to her knuckles. The way he had at the altar, once, slow. This time he closed his eyes. She broke, quietly, without sound. The tears came down her round, soft cheeks and her shoulders shook once, and she leaned forward, and she pressed her forehead to the top of his head, and she wept into his hair as he knelt at her feet. "He killed Marco," she said. "I know, my love. He killed Marco, Dante. I know. I want. What? Tell me anything, tell me. I want my brother." He gathered her down off the bed and onto the floor with him. He held her in his lap on the rug. He held her against his chest. He held her while she wept for the first time he had ever seen, and he understood, with the slow, widening certainty of a man who had been wrong about everything, that his small, soft, round-cheeked wife had been carrying this for 8 months without putting it down once. She had cried at no funeral. She had cried at no will reading. She had cried, in 8 months of widowhood and marriage and war, exactly once, on the rug in his bedroom on the night her brother's killer had been put in handcuffs. "I have you," he said into her hair. "Ileana, listen to me, I have you. I have you now, I am not Marco, I am not him, I will never be him, but I have you. You are not alone, do you hear me? You are not alone." "I know. Say it back to me. I am not alone." Again. "I am not alone, Dante." Again. "I am not alone." He held her on the rug for a long time. When she finally lifted her face, wet, swollen, soft, she looked up at him, and she said very quietly, "There is one more thing, about Marco, that I have not told you. Tell me. I have not been able to tell you. Ileana, tell me." She closed her eyes. "He was sick, Dante. He had been sick for 2 years, pancreatic, stage 4 when they found it. He had a year, maybe 18 months. He was given his diagnosis on a Tuesday in September, 2 years before he died. He came home that night and he sat on the edge of my bed and he told me. I sang to him, the same song he used to sing to me. I asked him what was going to happen tomorrow. He said, I'm going to start writing my will." He went very still under her. "He didn't die in an accident," she whispered. "He didn't die because they got lucky. Vincent got lucky because Marco let him. Marco chose. Marco chose where and when and how. Marco chose a meeting he knew he would not come back from. He chose to die on his feet. He chose to die in a way that would let him leave the city to a man he trusted. And his sister," her voice broke, "his sister to a man he loved." The room was very quiet. He understood, with a slow, dawning recognition that was like cold water down his spine, what he had not understood for 8 months. The way Marco had gripped his shoulder at their last drink in October. The way Marco had said, "You're a good man, Dante. You're a better man than you know." The way Marco had hugged him, hard in the doorway, and held the hug a beat too long, and Dante had laughed and shoved him off and Marco had laughed back and the laugh had been wet, and Dante had not known why, and had not asked. He had not asked. He had not asked. "He said goodbye to me," Dante said very quietly. "I didn't know he was saying goodbye to me. I thought he was drunk. He was saying goodbye. He said goodbye to me, Ileana. He loved you, Dante. He loved you the way he loved me. He chose us for each other because he could not bear to leave either of us alone." Dante Moretti, who had not cried in 15 years, who had not cried at his father's casket, who had not cried at the funeral of his oldest friend, who had not cried at his own wedding to a woman he had thought was the price of a debt. Dante Moretti pressed his face into the soft, warm shoulder of the small, round-cheeked woman he had married 8 months ago in a let-out wedding dress, and he wept. She held him. She held him for a long, long time. When the worst of it had passed, when he could breathe again, when he had wiped his face and pressed his mouth to the soft skin under her ear, and held her face in his hands again the way he had in the lamplit library, she looked up at him with her wet, swollen, round, soft face and her terrible, loving eyes, and she said, "Dante, yes, I want to give you something else now." "What?" "A child, your child, Marco's niece or nephew, someone who will know him only as a story and will know you as a father and will grow up in this house with the rose garden and the constellation ceiling and the song our mothers sang. I want to give you a life, Dante, the kind he wanted us to have, the kind he died to leave us. I want to give you that." He could not speak. He nodded. He held her face in his hands and he nodded, and his thumbs traced the wet cheeks, and he kissed her, slow, trembling with the whole of him, and she kissed him back, and he carried her, finally, to the bed. In the lamplight, in the bedroom of the house his uncle had once tried to kill him in, Dante Moretti made love to his wife for the first time as a free man. He took his time. He was not in a hurry. He was a man who had been given, against every expectation, a home, and he was determined to live in every room of it. He kissed the soft, full curve of her shoulder. He kissed the soft, full line of her hip. He kissed the round, soft place under her ribs that he had spent 4 months not looking at, and would, for the rest of his life, look at as the most beautiful thing in any room he had ever walked into. He told her, in her hair, in her ear, against her mouth, "I love you, I love you, I love you," with the fluency of a man who had not, before her, known he was capable of saying the words at all. She told him back. Outside, in the rose garden, the wind moved through the empty trellises. Inside, in the lamplight, 2 small, still pale hands locked at the back of a man's neck and did not let go. The roses bloomed properly that year. The gardener had pruned them right. Their daughter was born in the spring. She had her mother's dark hair. She had her father's grave eyes. She had, from the very first hour, the perfect stillness of a child who would, one day, be very, very dangerous in a quiet way. And Eliana, holding her in the hospital, had looked up at Dante with the small, private smile he had spent his life learning to read, and she had said, "Oh no. Oh no. Dante, I know that face, I have that face. I have known that face since she was an hour old," he said. "I have plans for that face. It is going to learn 3 languages and 4 martial arts and how to take apart a balance sheet by the time it is 10. Dante." "What?" "You sound exactly like my mother." "Good." She laughed. He kissed her forehead. He kissed his daughter's forehead. They named the girl Marcella, after her uncle, after the boy who had given them everything. Marcella Vasquez Moretti, who had her mother's hands and her father's stillness, grew up in a house with a constellation ceiling and a rose garden, and the song her grandmother had once sung in 2 different boroughs in 2 different decades. She was 4 when she beat the gardener at chess. She was 5 when Magda, 82, still fearing nothing, taught her to swear in Polish. She was 6 when she came down the stairs one morning in her pajamas and walked into the dining room where Dante was reading the paper and said, very seriously, "Papa, the man in the green car at the end of the driveway has been there for 2 days. I do not like his face." Dante put the paper down. He walked slowly to the window. He looked out at the end of the driveway. He turned around. He looked at his 6-year-old daughter, who had her mother's hands folded in her lap and her father's stillness in her face, and he said, very quietly, "Marcella." "Yes, Papa." "What time did you first see the green car?" "Yesterday morning before Magda made the eggs. He was eating a sandwich. He had the sandwich wrapped in foil. He used his left hand. The car has a small dent on the right back panel. I did not see the license plate clearly because of the angle, but it had a 5 and a 7 in it, and I think he has been here twice. He left for 2 hours yesterday afternoon. He came back at 7. He stared at her. He stared at his small, dark-haired daughter, who was eating a piece of toast and watching him with eyes that did not flinch. He said very softly, "Ileana." Her mother, in the doorway with the coffee pot, smiled the small, private smile he had spent his life learning to read. "I told you, Dante, I have plans for that face." The man in the green car, as it turned out, was a private investigator hired by an estranged Benventura cousin who had been trying for 6 months to get a photograph that could prove the Morty Vasquez marriage was in any way fraudulent, for the purposes of contesting Marco's will, which had now been the cornerstone of the most powerful family in the city for 7 years. The investigator was given a polite cup of coffee by Salvator, a stern conversation by Dante, and a one-way ticket to Florida by Ileana. He did not come back. The cousin did not come back. The will held. It would always hold. Marco Vasquez had written it well. Their second child, a boy, was born when Marcela was 8. They named him Luca. He had his father's mouth and his mother's quiet, and he was from the first month. A child who slept through anything. Marcela, who had not liked Bobby's in theory, took one look at her brother in the hospital and decided, with the perfect stillness of a girl who had decided, that he was hers. She did not let anyone else hold him for a week. Dante, watching his 8-year-old daughter cradle his son in the rocking chair in the nursery, with the same small, careful hands her mother had once folded in his study, said quietly, "Ileana." "Yes. We have made 2 of you. We have. God help us. God help everyone else, Dante." He laughed. He kissed her. He kissed his daughter on the top of her head. He kissed his son. He stood in the lamplit nursery of the house his uncle had once tried to kill him in, and he held his wife around the waist, and he watched the stillness of his daughter holding the stillness of his son, and he understood, with a slow, widening warmth that had nothing in it of fear, that he was the luckiest man in 5 boroughs. He did not know, that night, that he had 2 more years. He did not know that the doctor's appointment Ileana had taken alone, 6 weeks before Sicily, 8 years ago, had been the first of many doctor's appointments. He did not know that the one she had taken last Tuesday had been the last. He did not know that she had been carrying it in her teeth for 6 months. He did not know, that night in the nursery, that the small private smile she gave him over their son's head, the smile she had given him in the doorway of his dining room with the coffee pot, and in the candle on Mulberry, and in the lamplit library, and in every room of every year of their marriage, had a different weight in it than usual. He would find out, 6 months later on a Tuesday in September. She told him the way her brother had told her. She came into his study without knocking. She closed the door behind her. She walked across the rug, small, soft, deliberate in her bare feet, and she came around the desk and she sat down in his lap. She put her arms around his neck. She put her cheek against his temple. "Dante." "Yes. I'm going to start writing my will." He went very still under her. He did not, for a long second, speak. He had known for 6 months that something was wrong. He had not asked. He had watched her at breakfast for 6 months, and he had known, with the slow, widening certainty of a man who had been wrong about everything once and refused to be wrong about it again, that she was carrying a thing in her teeth, and that she would put it down when she was ready, and that the only thing he could do for her in the meantime was love her every morning at the small round table by the window where his grandmother had taken tea. He had loved her every morning. He had not asked. She put her forehead against his. She said very softly, "I have 18 months, maybe 2 years. They've been wrong before, they might be wrong again. I will fight, Dante. If you want me to fight, I will do every treatment. I will swallow every pill. I will be brave for the children. I will be brave for you." "Ileana." "Yes. You first." She closed her eyes. "Dante. You first, do you hear me? Ileana, you first. I have decided. I decided in Sicily. I decided in the cemetery. I decided 8 years ago. You first, my love, you first." "Dante, you cannot." "I cannot what? I cannot decide. I have decided. I am not Ileana. I am not going to be the man who buries you. I told you. I told you in Sicily. I have decided. You first." She laughed. It was a small, wet, startled laugh that he had not, in 8 years, heard her have. Dante. Yes. That is not how it works. Then we will make it how it works. I will go first. I will go before you. I will. Husband. Yes. You sound exactly like me. He pressed his face into her hair. She held him. She held him for a long, long time. When the worst of the first wave had passed, when he could breathe again, when he had wiped his face on her shoulder and kissed the soft skin under her ear, and held her face in his hands again the way he had 1,000 times in their marriage, she lifted her face, and she looked at him with the wet, swollen, round, soft face, and the terrible, loving eyes that had been the only honest thing in his life for 8 years, and she said, very quietly, "There is something I want, Dante. Anything. Don't say that yet. Listen to me. I want 18 months of mornings. I want 18 months of breakfasts at the small round table by the window. I want 18 months of you walking Marcella to school. I want 18 months of bath time with Luca. I want 18 months of you reading to me in the lamplight when I am too tired to read myself. I want 18 months of the rose garden. I want 18 months of you, my husband, and I want to spend none of them in a hospital bed." He could not speak. "I want," she said softly, "to die in our bed, Dante, with my hand in yours, with Marcella in the chair by the window and Luca asleep on Magda's shoulder and the lamp on. I want, Dante, I do not want to leave them an image of me with tubes in my arms. I want them to remember me whole. I am asking you, my love, please to give me that, please." He held her. He held her for a very long time. When he could speak, he said, "All right, my love, all right." "Thank you." "Ileana." "Yes. I am going to need you to teach me how to be without you. I have not, Ileana, I have not been a man without you for 8 years. I do not know how to do it. I am going to need you to teach me." "I will. Promise me." "I promise, Dante." 18 months. 18 months. "All right, my love." "All right, husband." She had 13. She made the most of every one of them. She walked Marcella to school every morning until the last 6 weeks. She read to Luca every night until the last 3. She sat on the stone bench in the rose garden with Dante every evening of her life, in every season of those 13 months, and they did not, after the first night, talk much about the dying. They talked about the children. They talked about the song. They talked about the small Sicilian cemetery and the lemon tree and the inscription on his great-grandfather's stone. For his wife, everything. She made him say it back to her, on the stone bench in the last week, when she was too thin to walk to the kitchen on her own and too proud to admit it. For his wife, everything, Dante. And he had said it back to her, every time she asked, with the steady mouth of a man who had decided that the last thing his wife would hear from him was the only true thing he had to give her. She died in their bed on a Friday in March. The lamp was on. Marcella, who was 9, was in the chair by the window with her mother's hands folded in her lap. Luca, who was 18 months, was asleep on Magda's shoulder in the doorway. Salvator was in the hall, his face wet, his hand on the door frame to hold himself up. Dante was on the bed. He had her hand in his. He had her hand in his the way she had once put her small, soft palm flat against his in the lamplit library. Kai Sao, hand listening, the touch she had spent her life teaching him, and he was listening. He was listening to her go. She turned her face toward him on the pillow. She said very softly, "Dante." "Yes, my love." "You first." He laughed. It was a small, wet laugh that everyone in the room heard, and no one in the room ever forgot. "Yes, my love," he said, "me first." "I love you. I love you, Ileana. Tell Marco I will, my love, I will tell him. Tell him I know what to tell him, I know, my love, I will tell him." She closed her eyes. She did not open them again. The lamp burned down. Marcella did not move from the chair. Luca slept on Magda's shoulder. Salvator in the hall slid down the door frame, very slowly, until he was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. Dante on the bed held his wife's hand, and he listened to the Kai sow go out of it, the way she had taught him. And when he could not feel her any longer, he leaned forward, and he pressed his mouth to her knuckles, the way he had at the altar 9 years ago in the most cursory gesture of his life, and the way he had 1,000 times since. This time he closed his eyes. He stayed there for a long, long time. The cemetery was small. He had it built behind the rose garden, in a corner of the property, under a young lemon tree he had planted himself the week she was diagnosed, and which had in 13 months decided to live. He had her stone made of Carrara marble. He had it carved in 2 languages, English and Sicilian dialect, and the inscription was the one she had asked him for in the small Sicilian cemetery 8.5 years before she died. It read, Ialiane, vi scusi amore ti. The dates. And beneath the dates, in his hard square hand. For his wife everything. He sat in front of it every morning at 6. He drank his coffee there. He told her about the children. He told her about the day. He told her about the city. He did not, in the first year, get up from the bench until the cold or Magda or Marcella made him. He sat there in winter in his coat. He sat there in summer with the bees. He sat there on the morning Marcella turned 10, and on the morning Luca said his first full sentence, Papa, where his mama, and Dante had walked to the cemetery and told Ileana, and he had cried for the first time since the funeral, and Marcella, who had followed him, had crawled into his lap on the bench and put her small, careful hands on his face and said, Papa, Mama said you would do this. She said I should hold your face when you did. So I am. And Dante had held his daughter for an hour, and his daughter had held his face for an hour, and the lemon tree had begun, very tentatively, to bloom. He never married again. He raised the children. He raised them well. Marcella went to Yale. Luca went to MIT. They did not, either of them, go into the family business. Ileana had been clear in her will on that point, and Dante had been clearer. And the family business was, in the end, quietly absorbed into a series of legitimate concerns, ports and trucking, and a small chain of restaurants on the East Coast, run by a board of directors that included exactly 0 killers and a great many lawyers. The Morty name became, over 30 years, a name that was no longer feared. It was a name that was respected. It was a name that endowed scholarships and built hospital wings, and every year on the anniversary of Ileana's death, sponsored a small concert at Carnegie Hall by a young soprano singing Greek poetry, which was, in its quiet way, the most powerful thing the Morty name had ever done. Dante lived to be 79. He died on a Tuesday in March in his own bed, in the lamplit room he had shared with his wife for 9 years and lived in alone for 30 more. Marcella was in the chair by the window. She had her mother's hands. She had grown into them. Luca was on the other side of the bed. He was holding his father's hand the way his mother had taught his father to hold a hand. The lamp was on. Magda had been dead for 15 years. The new housekeeper, who had loved Dante as much as Magda had, was crying in the hallway. Salvator had been dead for 10 years. Salvator had been buried, by Dante's order, on the property, near the rose garden, with a stone that read he was a good man and he was loyal and I loved him *. Dante had written the words himself. He had not let anyone edit them. On the last day of his life, Dante Moretti turned his face toward his daughter on the pillow. He said very softly, Marcella. Yes, Papa. Tell your mother. I will, Papa. Tell her I know what to tell her, Papa. I know, Papa, I will tell her. He laughed. It was a small, wet laugh that his children heard and never forgot. You sound exactly like me, he said. I have been told. Marcella. Yes, Papa. She went first. I know, Papa. She was not supposed to. I had decided. I know, Papa. She did it anyway. Yes, Papa. He closed his eyes. He smiled, very faintly, at the ceiling. Stubborn woman, he said. Yes, Papa. I am going to see her now. Marcella. Yes, Papa. Do not make her wait. I won't, Papa. Tell her I am coming. Tell her I. Papa. Yes. She knows. He smiled again. He did not open his eyes. He whispered, very softly, into the lamplit dark of the room he had shared with his wife. The words he had whispered into the cold ear of a friend on a parking garage floor 38 years before. The words he had whispered into the hair of his sleeping wife on the night their daughter was born. The words that had been, in the end, the only thing he had ever needed to say to anyone. "Thank you." He went. In a small cemetery behind a rose garden, under a lemon tree that had lived for 30 years, two stones stood next to each other in the morning light. One was Carrara marble. One was darker stone, not yet weathered. Marcella Morty, who was 39, who had her mother's hands and her father's stillness, stood in front of them at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee in her hand and her brother beside her. And she read the inscription on her father's stone, which she had chosen herself, and which was carved beneath the dates in the same hard square hand her father had used for the inscription on her mother's. I went first, eventually, and underneath that, in a smaller hand, for his wife everything. The lemon tree moved in the wind. Behind them, in the great house, a child laughed, Marcella's daughter, who was 4, who had her grandmother's dark hair and her grandmother's stillness and her grandmother's perfect, quiet hands. And the laugh carried out across the rose garden and up to the cemetery and into the morning. Marcella smiled. She lifted her coffee. She said very quietly to the two stones under the lemon tree, "Good morning, Mama. Good morning, Papa." The wind moved through the roses. Inside, the child laughed again. And every man in 5 boroughs who had once feared Dante Moretti had by then been buried by his sons, and every man who had sat at the wedding 9 years before and laughed quietly into his wine at the chubby little nothing on the altar had been buried before that. And every man who had ever underestimated Ileana Vasquez Morty had, in the end, learned the same lesson. The slow, patient, cruel lesson that had begun on a Tuesday in late October, when a small, soft, silent woman in a let-out wedding dress had stood at an altar across from the most dangerous man in New York, and had not flinched at his cursory mouth on her cold knuckles. The lesson was simple. The lesson was this. In a city full of feared men, the most dangerous person in the room was always the one nobody had bothered to look at. She had been in the back of every room of her brother's life. She had been in the back of every room of her husband's life. She had been in the back of the room at every Christmas dinner Dante Moretti had attended for 8 years, and he had walked past her every time, and the day he stopped walking past her was the day his life began. He had thanked his oldest friend for it, in the end, every day of his life. Every man, they say, in 5 boroughs, on the night the news of Dante Moretti's death went out, lowered his glass. They lowered it for the boy who had married his sister, to his best friend from beyond the grave. They lowered it for the chubby little sister who had run a city from a chair in an East Wing for 30 years, and had never once, in all of that time, asked for credit. They lowered it, most of all, for the love story. The one nobody, on the day of the wedding, had thought was a love story. The one that had outlasted them all,